traditional homelands of the 4 bands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians: Upper Band, Middle Band, Lower Band, Chewelah Band. Since time immemorial, the Spokane Tribe of Indians has lived and cared for these grounds, identifying themselves as flesh of the earth. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We show gratitude to the land, river, and peoples who have been fishing, hunting, harvesting, and gathering here for generations. May we learn from one another's stories so that we may nurture the relationship of the people of the Spokane Tribe and to all those who share this land. The presentation you're about to enjoy is part of Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau program. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to opening minds and bridging divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. Thanks to support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, and generous private donors, Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau presenters visit all corners of the state. I would encourage you to visit their website, www.humanities.org, to find other events like this one. So Amanda Van Lanen is a professor of history at Lewis Clark State College and the author of the Washington Apple, Orchards and the Development of Industrial Agriculture. She earned a Ph.D. in history at Washington State University and blogs about food history at historyreheated.com.
Well, thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's a big crowd. I know it's a gorgeous evening and it's hard to be inside on an evening like this, so I really appreciate you coming. And I appreciate Humanities Washington for all of the funding that they do to get speakers like myself out into communities. And I would encourage you tonight, if you have questions, especially since we're such a small group, don't be shy to raise your hand and we can have more of a conversation rather than me just standing up here and talking the whole time. So as Becky mentioned, I'm at Lewis Clark State College. And my book, The Washington Apple, will be out in paperback next month, anywhere books are sold. So if you're interested, you can purchase it online. I got interested in this topic because when I was a kid, my parents were missionaries, and we lived in Saipan, a little island out in the Pacific. And in our little grocery store, thousands of miles away from the mainland, we could get apples year-round. Beautiful, red, delicious apples, until you bit into them. And then they were just gross and mushy. And I see people in the crowd making faces, and I know folks have had this experience where you pick up the apple and you bite into it, and it's just not what you were expecting. So when I was a kid, I didn't get the big deal about why everyone thought apples were so fantastic, because only apples I had had experience with were those subpar grocery store apples. At the same time, how amazing is it that we could buy apples year-round in our little grocery store in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? So when I moved back, and my grandma, I should say, grew up in Milton Freewater. So when I moved back and actually had fresh orchard apples, and then I got what everyone was raving about. They are delicious. But that got me thinking, well, how did this happen? How did Washington become the apple state? How did we get to this point where apples are an industrial product that are shipped around the globe that anyone can have? Now, when we think about industrial products, we think about things where you can add value, like Oreo cookies, right? You can take flour and you can make cookies and you can package them and sell them. Think about what you can add to a piece of fruit. It's an apple. If you're going to sell a fresh apple, it's still a fresh apple. So that's something that growers in Washington had to figure out. How are we going to sell our fruit? How are we going to get people to buy our apples when it's an apple? It's a very common thing that everyone has everywhere. Now, apples are big business in Washington today. Over a $2 billion industry, and that is the highest value agricultural commodity in the state. Apples are shipped around the globe. And so this is really important, big business. Now, even if you look at the Washington Apple Commission's website today, they have a little promotional video. Why Washington? It's because our soils are good. And we have all these lovely volcanic soils in central Washington that are fed with clear water coming down from our mountain streams and all of our days of sunshine. And it sounds almost like the brochures that you would see from 100 years ago, encouraging people to move to Washington and start growing apples. And all of those things are true. But we've got some big things not going in our favor. We are a long way from markets. So does anyone know, want to take a guess what percentage of the nation's apples Washington grows?
60.
So 60, I hear 70? 70%. Okay. I actually had a job interview in Georgia several years ago, and one of the people interviewing me had recently been to an apple festival in Georgia, and they got gift baskets for the apple festival full of Washington apples. So we are everywhere, but we're at the far corner of the nation. So distance from markets is something we also have to overcome. See if you notice this map, the 5 kind of primary growing regions, north central Washington, the Wenatchee, Okanagan, Yakima Valley, Hood River, the Walla Walla, and Spokane. These are all east of the Cascade Mountains. And this is something I don't have to explain to you folks. But when I've given this talk back east, everyone assumes Washington is the evergreen state, right? Of course you get plenty of rain, and it's lush and green. And I have to explain, well, no, actually, eastern Washington is quite dry. And in fact, in these areas, just immediately in the rain shadow of the Cascades, the 2 largest growing districts in the state, they get 7 to 10 inches of rain a year on average. So this is not the kind of lush growing environment that people might assume when they hear that people are growing apples. So that's something that also I've run into. Apples actually originate in Asia, and they came to Europe with various successions of people trading and invading. Both the Greeks and the Romans practiced grafting and had prize apples, and those apples spread throughout Europe with Roman invasions. Now, apples are an interesting plant. They don't grow true to seed. So if you plant seeds from a red apple, you're probably not going to get a red apple. You're rolling the genetic dice. That apple could be yellow or green or red or pink or some combination of colors. It could be big or small, sweet or tart. All of those different genetic factors, you never know what you're going to get, which leads apples to being a very diverse species, all different kinds. In fact, I saw some figures that there are about 7,500 different varieties of apples being grown in the United States today, somewhere. Washington grows about 30 varieties commercially. So that's the great thing about apples. They play such a number of roles. So for settlers coming to America, they brought their favorite trees with them. Some of those trees would ripen early, some would ripe later. Some have apples you can eat right now. Some have apples that are good through the year. And those were all qualities that were prized by farmers. Now, people ate their apples fresh, but they would also, at the end of the season, let their hogs run into their orchards and eat all the leftovers, so fatten their pigs up. And they would also turn a lot of these apples into cider, which was a big part of American culture until Prohibition came along. So these trees are part of your life if you're a farmer. This is a key plant that's helping to sustain your family in many different ways. Now, these trees are also very important culturally because for immigrants coming from Europe to America, these trees represented home. This was a plant they carried across the Atlantic Ocean with them, and that they would plant in their new homes. They would kind of give them that connection with what they had left behind. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Johnny Appleseed. Okay, he was actually a real person, John Chapman, and we may be familiar with the Disney cartoon, or which was based on the earlier 1870s story from Harper's Monthly magazine of John Chapman, the wilderness wanderer who went around barefoot in his rags, passing out religious tracts and apple seeds. That's only part of the story. What isn't told in that kind of romanticized version of the story is that if you were living in the old Northwest, Indiana, Ohio, that part of the world, you had to actually plant 50 apple or pear trees to prove your land claim. So this just isn't about food or that connection of home. This is about making a legal stake on your property and proving that you own the land and that you settled it at a certain point in time. Because you could point to those trees and say, I planted that, see how big it is. Believe me that I've been here for X number of years. So having those seeds to plant was really important. Even better if you could get a tree from a nursery that was already started. And so John Chapman actually owned several nurseries in Indiana and Ohio over the years where he sold saplings to eager settlers who wanted to prove up on their land claims. So apples are really important as Americans move west for a host of reasons. Now, in our neck of the woods, the very first apple tree was planted at Fort Vancouver sometime in the 1820s. And Fort Vancouver was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, fur trading company, and this was one of their outposts. Now, Hudson Bay Company employees in the Northwest didn't really like eating local food. They didn't care for salmon, they didn't care for the other things that we had to offer. And so the company was spending a tremendous amount of money importing flour around the tip of South America to Vancouver. Super expensive. One winter, company employees butchered 600 horses to eat because they didn't want to eat salmon. Also, hugely expensive for the company. So McLaughlin is thinking, how can we do something about this? Now, the Hudson Bay Company had experimented with farms in the Red River Valley, kind of north of where Minnesota is today. And they had had good success growing grain for their fur trappers in the more eastern district of their operations. And so McLaughlin tries something similar at Fort Vancouver. He plants all kinds of grains, timothy, alfalfa, oats, wheat, all kinds of vegetables, and fruit. Now, the story of how the very first fruit tree gets to Vancouver it's a very romantic story. There was a young gentleman having his last dinner in London, and there's a young lady next to him, and she eats her apple for dessert and wraps the seeds in her handkerchief and hands it to him to put in his pocket to remember her by. So he tucks it in his pocket, and when he gets to Fort Vancouver several weeks later, he remembers the seeds and they plant it, thus giving birth to the first apple tree in the Northwest, and by extension, the apple industry in the Northwest.
Is that a true story?
Good question. I don't think so. I'm skeptical that it's a true story. Narcissa Whitman, who was one of the early missionaries to come to the Northwest, she writes about it in her diary. So we know that by the time the Whitmans came in the 1830s, that story was being circulated. But we also know that someone from the London Horticultural Society visited Fort Vancouver in 1824, and that McLaughlin had ordered seeds. So I don't know if it's true or not. It's a great story. It's a legend. Yeah, it's an absolutely great story. And we see it being repeated, especially in the early 1900s when the fruit industry was really getting going. And some of the first histories of fruit growing in the Northwest like to cite it as kind of a fairy tale almost, right? It was meant to be. It was meant to be that we would be the apple state because of this young man and this young woman and their doomed romance. Yeah. Unfortunately, the old apple tree in Vancouver died the first summer of the pandemic. So it lasted until 2020 and died that first summer of the pandemic. Yeah. So McLaughlin actually has success. So when the missionaries first come to the Northwest, the Spaldings and the Whitmans, they see this. They see how well things are growing. And both Marcus Whitman and Henry Spalding take cuttings of trees from Fort Vancouver back to their missions. So Whitman plants trees near Walla Walla, and Henry Spalding plants trees at Lapwai, Idaho. And the Nez Perce also get cuttings of those trees from Henry Spalding and plant some of those on the Washington side near the Snake River. So the fertility of the soil is great. The missionaries come. And one of the things that the missionaries do is they help publicize how great the Northwest is. They don't always have great success in their missionary endeavors, but they are very successful in letting Americans know, hey, there's great farming in the Willamette Valley. Hey, the Hudson's Bay Company is growing all of this great stuff. The soil is amazing. You should come move here and farm. And so that's what happens. By the 1840s and 30s, we have Americans coming on the Oregon Trail. Now, the very first apple trees, not seeds, but actual trees with actual varieties coming into the Northwest were brought by a guy named Henderson Lewing. Now, Lewing and his brothers come from a long line of orchard families. They had had nurseries in North Carolina, and then they had moved to Illinois and finally Iowa when they decided to come to Oregon. Again, nurseries are very important because people need trees to prove up their claims. And so Henderson Lewing has this really audacious idea that he is going to build these nursery wagons and put dirt in them and plant his trees in the wagons and bring them live across the Oregon Trail. So he brings about 700 trees across this way. He gets to Wyoming and he runs into someone who had tried this and abandoned his wagon. He's like, "You're never gonna get him over South Pass. Your trees will freeze. This is a fool's errand." And fortunately, Henderson Lewing didn't listen to that person and kept going, and almost all of his fruit trees survived. Now, Marcus Whitman, by this point, this is 1847, Marcus Whitman had been meeting Oregon wagon trains in the Blue Mountains to guide them across the Blue Mountains in that last bit of their journey. And when Marcus Whitman encountered the Lewings, he immediately latched onto this and he wanted them to come to the mission at Waiilatpu. And Henderson Lewing said, "No, we're gonna go on to the Willamette Valley. That's where we were starting for." And they parted ways. Probably good for Henderson Lewing because a few months later, Marcus Whitman would be dead in the Whitman Massacre. But Lewing takes these trees to the Willamette Valley. He and his brother set up the first nursery in the Willamette Valley, and their trees are in high demand by other farmers moving in who want fruit and who want the trees. So it takes a few years for trees to get established and start producing fruit. 1849, the gold rush happens. People start flooding into California. By 1850, there are 120,000 people living in California. They are desperate for fresh things. In fact, I ran into an account of a young miner who had been up in the hills and came down to town for supplies and was so desperate for something fresh, he just saw a stand there with onions and picked up the first thing, the first onion he saw and ate it raw. And started to eat a second one until he thought, I should ask how much this costs. And it was exorbitantly expensive. So in 1853, Lewing and his brother decide to ship some fresh apples to the goldfields in California. They box up 2 boxes of apples, they put iron straps around them so no one will steal them, and they send them to Sacramento where they sell for $2.50 a pound, which is about the equivalent of $80 to $90 a pound today. So, of course, this gives others in Oregon the idea to ship their extra produce down to the goldfields, and for a brief time, growers in Oregon clean up. Eventually, folks are going to decide, well, we should plant trees in California a little closer to the population centers. And that's what happens. In Watsonville, California, they establish an orchard district. And Henderson Lewing actually will move down there and help start those orchards in Watsonville, California. He'll relocate. So for a time, it seems like there's going to be an apple industry, but then it all kind of collapses because California is now producing apples. And you're not making $80, $90 a pound. You're making $5 or $10 a pound. And it's suddenly not so economically viable. We see this pattern repeated again and again in the Northwest with various mining booms. So when gold is discovered in Orofino and in Lewiston in the early 1860s, orchards get planted in Walla Walla to supply all that mining traffic. Gold is discovered in north central Washington. Folks start planting orchards up there. And in fact, some of the first orchards planted in central Washington were planted by miners who had failed at mining, but decided to turn their mining apparatus into irrigation structures and try growing fruit or try growing some other kind of crop. So little by little, we get these bits of experimentation as folks are, again, bringing apples with them wherever they're living and trying to grow them for profit. So the question I started with when I started my work on this project was, why Washington? Because in a lot of ways, it doesn't make sense. When we're talking about commercial apple production, in the early 1900s, when Washington's apple industry started, New York was king. New York was the place that had all the commercial orchards. close to New York City, close to Philadelphia and Boston, and all the major population centers. There were also major commercial orchard districts in Virginia and the Ozarks and Michigan, and a whole bunch of other places. So it doesn't kind of intuitively make sense that Washington is the place on the map where we're going to grow these apples because we are so far away from so many other things. What happens, though, is a convergence of several factors. The railroads get built through central Washington in the 1880s and 1890s, and that opens up transportation. Now, the railroads make their money by hauling stuff. And so I worked a lot with the railroad records of the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. There's about 20,000 cubic feet of material. Fortunately, not all of it about apples, so I could get through in a couple trips. But what the railroads were doing is they were looking at all the land along their lines and trying to figure out what was going to be most profitable. What areas are best for growing wheat? What areas are best for irrigation and fruit? What areas are good for mining or timber? Okay. Pick a Western industry, you're going to find railroad officials behind it in some way, shape, or form. Whether it was a subsidiary corporation or an independent corporation, and when you look at the board of directors, like half of them are railroad officials. So the railroad has their fingers in a lot of different economic activities, and they are actively planning how to sell the lands along their lines and how to make them most profitable. So when they're advertising, they're thinking about this. The other thing that coincides with this is the development of irrigation. In places where the railroads are, and everyone's kind of looking at the map, and it's not good for dryland farming, irrigation by the turn of the century becomes an option. And so both the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific, quite reluctantly I should add, end up investing in irrigation systems. Because they know we've got this desert land, we're not going to sell it if folks can't farm it. So we have to irrigate it so that we can sell it, then folks can produce a product. So the railroads are really instrumental here in helping to get these things going because they invest in the irrigation companies, they're invested in the real estate companies selling the land, and of course, they're invested in the modes of transportation. So if we look at how many trees there are, and this is 1916, this is when things are really starting to get going good. Apple trees are planted everywhere in Washington. Every county has some apple trees. In fact, the fruit industry is so important that even from statehood in 1889, from the very beginning, the state had a department of horticulture. And very early on, the state had laws regulating fruit growing. So for example, you had to spray your fruit for insects. Because if you don't spray your fruit for insects, that's going to ruin your neighbor's fruit, and we can't have that. So very early on, even the state had these kind of laws because fruit was so important. So I live in Asotin County, which is as far southeast as you can get, and this is how many trees we had in 1916. And we are very proud of our orchard history down there too. That's a lot of trees, okay? Until we look at Spokane County. Yeah. And the two largest districts, the Okanagan and Chelan County, were considered one district for the purposes of the state. So combined, about twice as much as Spokane. And then Yakima. So our little orchards in Asotin County are pretty small in comparison to these other major growing districts that are developing around the state. And again, this is partly because the railroads are looking to say what is best suited. So we see advertisements like this. This is from the Northern Pacific Railway, and I love this one. You just see literally a quarter-mile pile long of apples. Okay. Now, part of the reason they chose apples is because irrigation is expensive. And if you're going to have an irrigation system, you need to grow a crop that's going to make more money. Now, we could grow wheat or something like that, but the Palouse and Walla Walla country are some of the best wheat growing country in the world. And if we're irrigating wheat in Yakima, we can't compete. We can't compete with Walla Walla wheat. It's just not going to happen. Apples, though, we can sell for a higher price. And Washington apples sold for about 3 times as much as apples grown in New York, and I'll talk about that more. And apples last for a fairly long time. And with the primitive transportation they had at this time, with iced refrigeration in the rail cars, you could transport apples back to major population centers back east, and they would get there in one piece, and you could sell them. So apples were really the crop that they focused on. Now, people tried a lot of different things. Folks wanted to try growing vegetables or rhubarb or soft fruit. So the problem with cherries and apricots and that kind of thing is that you have to can them. They're not gonna last on a cross-country voyage. But the railroad settled on apples. And in fact, I ran across letters in the railroad archive where people were writing in and asking, hey, what about sugar beets? Would this be good country for sugar beets? And they wrote them back and said, no, we're promoting apples in this district. If you're gonna move here, that's what we hope you will produce. So the railroads are really taking a hand in this kind of planned economic development. And if we think about it, it does make sense because you have to have infrastructure. You have to have cold storage houses. You have to have packing plants. You need a critical mass of people to be able to support that infrastructure. And so the railroads are really promoting that and encouraging that critical infrastructure.
For the irrigation, were they just building like massive pipelines, or were they similar to the canal systems that they were?
Both, actually. Most of the early ones were canals, and some of them were wood-lined. They did have some pipelines that they built in places where they needed that, also mostly out of wood at first. Yeah, the irrigation projects in Wenatchee and Yakima were both started with private money, which is kind of an anomaly in the West because most of the irrigation projects started in the Western US were funded by government funds. And these were actually started with private funds. And those private investors did go to the railroads for support, and the railroads, knowing this would likely be a losing venture, didn't want to invest at first, but in both cases ended up taking ownership. And then eventually in Yakima, the Sunnyside Canal, they did give over to the federal government eventually. Yeah.
And so if you are a party and you buy a piece of property from the railroad, you have to promise that you're going to grow apple. That's the contract.
It was never in the contract specifically, but that's the understanding. Yeah. It's not written in your contract that you have to, but that's what you're encouraged to do. So in addition to the railroads, all of the towns in Washington and the different real estate companies also had their own advertising ventures trying to get people to move to Washington. This is one of my favorite. This is from Granger, which is in the Yakima Valley, literally picking dollars off of the trees. Okay. It grows on the trees. Yeah, and Wenatchee later used that as a slogan, where dollars grow on trees. When you read these brochures, they make it seem deceptively simple. All you gotta do is, plunk the trees in the ground and then sit back and wait, and the money's gonna roll in. And they tell you how much profit you're gonna make, and that it's so easy, anybody can do it. And in fact, a lot of these orchard lands were marketed to middle-class individuals who were looking for a change of pace. So if you're a school teacher and you're tired of it, you're an accountant, you're tired of it, you own a store and you're tired of it, come start an orchard. Okay? You get to be in the good outdoors, you get to be your own business person, own your own fruit ranch. Okay? Super easy. Now, as you can imagine, I see some head shaking. If you are someone who has no experience with farming, you're not going to have instant success by any stretch of the imagination. Add to that, it's not just farming. Even if you have farming experience, now you're dealing with irrigated farming. And that's another whole beast. So a lot of people in the early years really struggled with what to do. We have accounts from the county agents and from the scientists at the state agricultural colleges talking about people packing the roots of their trees, that it was like with so much dirt and packing it in so hard that they may as well just poured concrete around their trees because they had packed them in so hard. Or people, we've got to wait 3 to 5 years before these trees start producing apples. I got to make money in the meantime. And so people would plant things in between the rows of their crops, in between the rows of their trees, other crops like rhubarb or something that would choke out the young trees. So all kinds of mistakes being made And the agricultural college is really stepping in, and expert growers also stepping in to try to offer that advice to newcomers, how to do it and how to deal with all of these issues. Because it is much more complicated than simply just dunking the tree in the ground and calling it good. You've got to prune your trees, you've got to fertilize, you've got to spray for insects, and then you've got to pick and pack your apples, and then you've got to figure out how to market them. And we're a fairly small state. We don't have big population centers around most of our towns at this time. Local markets are pretty quickly saturated, so where are you going to sell your apples? So all of these things, it's not that easy.
So does Washington State University contribute to
Very much.
education now?
Yes, very much so. They did. They have from the beginning as Washington State College and now Washington State University. Yeah, and Oregon State College as well. Both of those institutions doing a lot of research to help the fruit industry get started. And so it's everything. How do we deal with pests, insect pests? What's the best way to keep your trees from freezing if we get a thaw? All of the things with growing and also all the things with marketing. All of those scientists are going to be so important in helping figure out these problems. Absolutely. And which varieties to plant? Yeah. And new varieties today. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the things, in some ways that hasn't changed. Growers are still dealing with a lot of the same problems that they were dealing with 100 years ago, and still having that partnership, the industry having that partnership with the colleges is really important, and the universities. So when I've given this talk back east, everyone likes to tell me, well, your Western apples, they were irrigated, so you didn't have to deal with the same tree diseases that we do back east. Okay, well, they weren't exactly the same, but we did have to deal with tree diseases. And the biggest problem was the codling moth, and you can see there in the illustration what they can do to an apple. This was the real bane of growers' existence in Washington. Because again, if we're gonna sell our apples, we have to sell our apples at a higher price. We really need to have an edge over Eastern markets. And part of that is making sure we have apples without worms and apples that are perfect looking and beautiful. And so, well, how do we get rid of those worms? Pesticides. So in the early years, they tried all kinds of different remedies. I mean, basically, what can we throw on our trees that will kill these things? By the 19-teens and 1920s, the primary pesticide being used is lead arsenate. So yes, we know this is a poison, but it also kills the worms. So you can see there, this is a pretty common of spraying. I've had people mention, they're not wearing safety gear. In the historical accounts, they were aware that this could potentially be poisonous, and I did run into accounts of people knowing that they probably should wear safety gear, but saying that they didn't because it was too hot. Like, I couldn't breathe with my mask on. It was just easier just to go out and spray. So in the early years, growers are very enthusiastic about this. If the agricultural college says you need to do 3 sprays, a lot of growers are like, well, they say to do 3, I'm gonna do 4. 4 is better than 3. And there's accounts of them spraying these pesticides to the point where they're literally dripping off the trees. Again, though, this is so critical to the industry to have those perfect apples to ship that this was vital. If you didn't spray, you could be fined. And if you didn't take the warning from the state horticultural agent, the state would come out and spray and send you the bill, because this was so important for growers to keep these worms under control and to keep them from spreading. Now, for the most part, this wasn't an issue, but I'll come back in a moment because this did eventually become an issue with consumers.
They would die.
Yeah, exactly, because we know arsenic is a poison. Absolutely. So growing the perfect apple, part of that is also what variety are we gonna plant. Now, even in the early days, in the 1890s and at the turn of the century, the state was recommending, pick 5 or 6 of these varieties that work well and stick to them. But growers were very experimental in the early days and growing dozens of different varieties. It's not really until later, after World War II, that we really see it narrowed down to 4 or 5 key varieties. They chose these varieties for different reasons. Ben Wagners, for example, apparently, I've never had one, but apparently they have a really thick skin. And growers would talk about how they don't grow Ben Wagners to eat themselves, but they grow them because they ship well. And they're really hardy and they don't bruise because of that thick skin. Growers were also responding to consumer demands. So there was an apple called a winter banana. I've never had one, but I've seen drawings of them. They're really beautiful. They're yellow and they have this beautiful pink blush at the top. Apparently they fell out of favor because consumers wanted apples that were all one color. And so they are picking them for characteristics that appeal to what consumers are buying. And so the first red deliciouses in Washington were planted in the teens and 20s. Red Delicious apparently at one point was delicious. That's how it got its name. The farmer that discovered it on his farm in Iowa, apparently it was a mutation of a tree and he picked the apple. He's like, oh, this is delicious. And so Stark Brothers Nursery in Missouri was the one that actually picked up that variety and started marketing it. And the reason the Red Delicious was so popular is because consumers liked the color and they liked the particular shape of that apple. And so that after World War II would become the dominant variety, even though they're not the best keepers as far as that goes. So a lot of experimentation in the early years, a lot of varieties being grown. In fact, there was a packer at one of the packing houses in Yakima that was said to be able to identify, I think, over 100 varieties on site. That's what he claimed. That when people were coming in with their loads to be packed, he knew which was which. So picking varieties that consumers like, making sure they look perfect, and then packing them in a way that is going to bring a higher price. So in Washington, all apples were graded and boxed based on size. So the lower the number, the bigger the apple, because it's based on how many apples fit in a box. Each apple is wiped off because lead arsenate leaves this nasty gray residue on apples. So they would wipe them off, wrap them in paper, and then pack them in apple boxes. Now back east, they were using barrels. And we never used barrels out here because we don't have a lot of the hard woods necessary for constructing barrels. And boxes just load better in a rail car. Plus, you get this nice real estate here on the side of the box where you can put a little extra advertising with an apple label. Now, back east, the advice for how to pack an apple barrel was to cram your apples in until you saw juice running out of the bottom of the barrel, and then to hammer the lid on. So you can imagine if you're a customer and you've got this barrel of apples that have been all crammed together, that are bruised, that are crushed, that are, maybe going a little moldy in places, versus being able to buy an apple out of a box that is wrapped in this beautiful paper. And yes, it costs 3 times as much, but maybe it's worth it because it's not covered in goo or bruises or wormholes or any of the other things.
Did you say it costs 3 times as much?
Costs 3 times as much. Yeah. So consumers really had to pay a premium for these apples. And that's the kind of thing, it's an apple, right? It's no different from the apples being grown in New York and packed into barrels when you get to it at the end of the day. But it's packaged differently and it's presented more beautifully. So
I wonder if that was a status symbol. Actually, able to afford 3 times.
I've never come across anything in the US about it being a status symbol, but American apples were shipped to Great Britain, and there they were a status symbol. And people would buy them and put them on their fruit bowl like at a dinner party, not to eat, but just to look at and admire and show that they could, that they could afford them.
You could compare it to Starbucks versus coffee.
You put the logo on it, put it in a different cup, exactly. So advertising is really key to this and helping the success of Washington apples. Because again, apples were grown everywhere. And there were many experiments even in the West to grow apples in places like New Mexico and Colorado, even Idaho and Montana. Washington growers, though, very early on are advertising because we don't have the markets nearby and they cost more. So we got to convince consumers somehow that they need to buy our apples. So the apple box labels were one way that that happened. And as you can see here, we've got the brand that it was inspected by the fruit rancher himself, kind of that personal touch, right? Each apple personally inspected by the owner to kind of give it that extra little something, and to try to catch your eye.
Well, it was packed especially for the buyer, it looks like.
Yeah, packed especially for the buyer. I mean, how special, you packed it just for me, right? Yeah, to try to give this a little extra something. Now, there were hundreds of these brands at the peak of this in the 1920s. Every grower wanted their own apple label, but we do see by the 1920s growers consolidating and some growers joining marketing cooperatives to try to pool the cost of advertising and to make it a little bit easier for everyone. And we will see a few big brands emerge. So this is an era at the turn of the century where we start to see the first cartoon branding. And that started in the 1890s with Yellow Kid, who was the first comic strip that was kind of nationally syndicated. And that was drawn by a guy named Richard Outcault. Now, Yellow Kid was so popular that all the companies started borrowing Yellow Kid to sell their goods. So there's Yellow Kid cigars and Yellow Kid soap and Yellow Kid chewing gum and hundreds of products. Now, Outcault, he actually sued these manufacturers to try to retain copyright on his comic. And his case actually got thrown out of court because the courts had never seen anything like this before. They didn't know what to do with it. So in the early 1900s, Outcault creates a new character, Buster Brown, and this time he's smart, he copyrights it, and he actually opens an advertising agency with his son specifically to manage Buster Brown as an advertising character. So most famously, the Buster Brown Shoe Company ended up adopting Buster Brown. But I thought it was really interesting. I also found Buster Brown in the Wenatchee newspaper trying to get growers to sell their apples to the Wenatchee Fruit Company. So there was a whole series of these that looked like Buster Brown cartoons that were published trying to get growers to sell their fruit to that company. Now we do get our own specific Northwestern brands. The Northwest Fruit Exchange starts in 1914, and in 1916 they introduce the cartoon Skookum Indian, which would become one of the most recognized of the Washington apple brands. And this is from 1921, this particular ad, but this was used very extensively. Advertisements in major American publications like Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal or Literary Digest, New York Times, all these kind of major outlets using this character. You could send away for a Skookum doll or Skookum coloring book or Skookum apple core, kind of a premium to get people to buy more of the apples. But this was something of a debate with growers. Where do you put your advertising dollars? Do you advertise to consumers, who are your end user, or do you advertise to grocers, who are going to be stocking it, or do you advertise further up in the food chain to wholesalers, who are going to be buying your apples in bulk and distributing them? So not all of the cooperatives in Washington agreed. Skookum was very much focused on targeting consumers, and there was not a year when they did not put advertising directly toward consumers. But some of the others, like Big Y and Wenatchee, Big Y, Blue Ribbon, and Blue Goose were kind of the other big ones with Skookum. They're kind of the big four. Big Y, in many years, didn't spend any money advertising directly to consumers. They worked with wholesalers and decided that was the best use of their money. So the railroads, the Northern Pacific, actually did a survey of this in the mid-1920s to try to see if consumers recognized brands. For the most part, consumers knew that they bought red, green, or yellow apples. and most consumers could not name a Washington brand. But about 16% of those surveyed could name Skookum. So, and this is consumers in New York, I should say. So that's a pretty good market share, given that at the time there were well over 250 Apple brands floating around on the market. So clearly the direct-to-consumer advertising was having some impact in recognition.
So what's the shift? I mean, just thinking about today, because today I don't really think people really look at brand, they look at variety, right?
So a couple of things happened. In the Depression, it really devastated the Apple industry. And so there were many in the industry that had been calling for statewide advertising for a long time. And that finally happened in 1937 with the Washington State Apple Commission. And so starting in 1937, the State Apple Commission takes over most of the domestic advertising. So we see Washington apples being the thing that's advertised more. In the early 2000s, there was a suit brought against the Washington State Apple Commission questioning the constitutionality of how they were structured. And since that point, they have been focusing mostly on export markets, and they haven't been advertising domestically for the last 20 years or so. So that's kind of where a shift has come. And then the varieties, there's a lot of varieties called club varieties, and people develop them and patent them and then sell them to growers. And so you have to have an exclusive contract to sell that variety. And so then it becomes about who's growing that specific variety rather than a region or a place. It becomes more about who has right to grow that variety. So that's been a change in the last 20 years too. Yeah. And I know every time I go to the grocery store, it seems like there's a new one that I've never heard of before, you know, and a little corner on the thing in the grocery store. Yeah, so that's a big change. So advertising through labels and through advertisements. But one thing I do want to talk about real quickly before we end tonight, shows were a big thing in early years, having expositions and fairs and things where people could come and could meet each other and could see the product and create interest in that way. So in 1908, Spokane decided that it was going to host the first ever National Apple Show. And the Chamber of Commerce put together a subcommittee to help run the Apple Show, and they went about trying to get growers from all the regions of the state to participate. Now, it says National Apple Show, but in reality, it's a Northwest Apple Show. They didn't really get people from back east or the other growing districts, because at this point in time, growers in New York, we're not even on their radar. They don't even care that we exist. And there's no way that they're going to spend the money to ship apples out to Spokane for a show. Okay. Now, this show had all kinds of different prizes where you could show off the bounty of your orchard. Everything from the big showcase, the carload. This is 630 boxes of apples. That represents the amount of apples that would fit in a carload, in a box carload. All the way down to the plate prizes, where you could display 3 apples on a plate and everything in between. So really an opportunity for growers on all spectrums to showcase what they were doing, including individuals who maybe weren't growing apples commercially. Well, this is H.M. Gilbert from Yakima. Folks in Yakima thought he was going to win. Turns out Mike Horan of Wenatchee won the Grand Boxcar Prize. Folks in Wenatchee celebrated. It's not a bonfire going, you know, yelling and having a big to-do in town. People in Yakima were really upset that this had happened. Now, Mike Horan of Wenatchee had hired a crack team of apple picking experts and had spent 4 months preparing his carload for the competition. H.M. Gilbert of Yakima, he just packed his car in 4 or 5 days like one would do normally. So already at this time, there's a lot of regional bickering and regionalism, because folks are trying to say, we're the best, you should move to our town. Every place is trying to promote their own interest. Spokane included, and that creates a lot of tension. And so the first year of the fair, Lewis Hill of the Great Northern had been the co-chair, and there's this whole, to-do with Wenatchee versus Yakima. He says, you know what? All the railroad presidents should take turns. Not it. So he passes it on to Howard Elliott of the Northern Pacific, who gets stuck with it for the next several years because no one else will take it on. The following year, both Yakima and Wenatchee threatened not to participate. Now, the show had decided to adopt the American Pomological Society grading rules, but those were less strict than the grading rules used in both Yakima and Wenatchee. And so they did not think that that was fair. So Howard Elliott had to travel to both places, try to talk them off a ledge. Of course, he was the president of the railroad that went through Yakima, so he's trying to maintain some neutrality in this situation. He personally donates $500 to use for the carload prize, and the organizers of the show put it on Red Delicious apples, which were not a variety grown in Yakima. So once again, Yakima's threatening not to participate because we can't win our railroad president's prize. It goes round and round, and finally they do get everyone to participate, but it never does become the national centerpiece that Spokane hopes it will. There's just too much infighting between the various groups. Both folks in Yakima and Wenatchee are suspicious of what Spokane is trying to do. Why is Spokane claiming that it's a big district? We grow more apples than they do. So there's just a lot of this kind of infighting and bickering, and eventually this kind of falls by the wayside in favor of other events like National Apple Week, which was sponsored by the International Apple Shippers Association. No competition. The International Apple Shippers Association simply served as a clearinghouse to say, here's some activities that you can do in your town to help promote apples during the last week of October. So store window displays, free giveaways, prizes, contests, whatever you want to do to help promote apples. Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into making apples a national product. Now, by this point, when National Apple Week really gets going in the 1920s, Washington is the primary producer of apples, and it has surpassed New York by this point to become the #1 apple producer in the country. My favorite Apple Week activity happened in 1927, but it almost didn't. So in 1926, now the US didn't have limits on how much arsenic could be on food, but Great Britain did. And in 1926, 25 and 26, several British grocery stores and consumers found American apples that had far in excess of the limited amount of arsenic. Now, the way that exports worked, those may or may not have come from Washington, but they were coming from the United States. And Britain was threatening to cut off all imports from the United States, which would have hurt growers everywhere. Now, at first, apple growers are like, what are they complaining about? There was this belief that all the arsenic would wash off with summer rains. We don't get summer rains. Well, it blows off. Well, maybe. There's still testing higher than what the British will allow. Growers are really defensive at first, and their main argument is, we are around these pesticides all the time. If anyone was going to be harmed by this, it's us. And in fact, I found an account of one gentleman who even claimed that he had drank water out of an old pesticide barrel, kind of as proof that this is not a problem. Growers eventually do have to come around, though. The threat of losing the British export market is too big. In addition, I mean, these are Washington Post, New York Times, right? These are pretty big newspapers to have arsenic and apples on the front pages when everyone knows that arsenic is a very deadly poison. This is hurting their relationship with consumers in the United States because of this publicity. So enter the state colleges, trying to figure out how we can get these extra residues off. Because again, we can't sell wormy apples. That's not going to be profitable. And this is the only product we have that we know kills the codling moth. Agricultural colleges are working very, very hard to try to come up with an alternative. But in the meantime, what they do is they wash the apples in a mild hydrochloric acid solution and they run them through these brush wiper machines to try to wash off the extra residue and bring them down within acceptable limits for the British export market. So up to this point, a lot of growers still packed their own fruit in their orchards. After this point, that's less tenable. People can't afford these brush washers. You really do need to join a cooperative or go to a packing house and have someone else handle that for you. So in the wake of that, National Apple Week almost didn't happen, but I'm glad it did because I think this is one of the coolest things. Yakima decided it was going to make the largest apple pie. This thing was 10 feet in diameter. They initially thought, we'll make an apple cake, that'll be easier to serve. But what's more American than apple pie? It's gotta be apple pie. So there are 450 gallons of filling in this thing that was pre-cooked by the local Libby McNeil factory. On the day of the event, they brought out the high school home ec class to roll out the crust on specially made rolling pins here. And a local hardware store custom made the knife so that they could cut it at the end of the day.
How did they bake the crust?
They actually constructed a special oven. They had an old building site that had like a brick basement that they kind of turned into an oven. It actually collapsed a few days before the event, and they had to hurry up and reconstruct it and rebuild it so that they could bake their pie. Yeah, and then to add insult to injury, after all of the news cameras were there and this went on the AP wire, somewhere wires got crossed and it was going into the newspapers saying that this event had happened in Seattle. And so, yeah, then were trying to scramble to get that corrected. Like, no, Yakima, not Seattle. So this is just the kind of thing that folks were doing to try to promote apples. And again, they weren't even sure they were going to have an event because the arsenic controversy had taken such a toll on everyone. But this is really a good way to promote apples again as something that's important for their community. And then I mentioned already the Washington State Apple Commission starting in 1937 after the Depression. It's kind of a way to consolidate advertising, which is something that many folks in the industry had been saying for years, but all the apple growers were so independent and they had been sold on Washington and sold coming out to these orchards based on the fact that they would get to be independent. And so they really were reluctant to form cooperations and to join with larger organizations. But the Depression really did force the hand with a lot of this kind of thing. So a lot of the problems that the apple industry faces today haven't really changed too much. How do we get people to eat more apples? I was talking with Mr. Mace's class earlier today and showing with them Americans eat on average 16 pounds of fresh apples a year. It's not a lot. We have a lot of choice. Even in the 1920s, we see growers talking about, bananas and oranges and all the other fruit that are on the market. You know, apples are the king of fruit. So why are people buying citrus? You know, how do we get people to eat more of our fruit? In fact, one marketer said something to the effect of, there was only 1 year when there were ever too many apples on the market, and that was when Eve was in the Garden of Eden. Hey, can't have too many apples. So something that's definitely a point of pride. Growers still have to deal with issues of marketing, with pesticides, consumers, all of these things. In some ways, not a lot has changed, but of course, in other ways, a lot is different in terms of technology and consumer tastes always evolving, the things that we value and the things that we want from our food. That's what I've got. Does anyone have questions?
We just had something in the paper. Was it in the paper or something about, we want you to name this apple?
Yeah, WSU's latest apple. Yeah, they're having a contest for folks to name it.
Yeah.
So we'll see who wins.
Who came up with apple a day keeps the doctor away?
I have not been able to track down where that originated. That is a very old saying.
Said there's George Washington that can't tell a lie. cutting down the apple.
Right, that originates with Parson Weems, that I do know. He was a minister and a school teacher who wrote up that little tale as an object lesson for children.
And do they have organic apples?
Yes, Washington produces about 85% of all the organic apples grown in the United States. Yeah, and that is something that is important to consider. Growers, they use the lead arsenate until the 1940s when DDT becomes available. And then they use DDT until it's banned in the 1960s. But what they were finding by the 60s and 70s is that over time, pests do become immune to the pesticides. And so by the 70s, more growers are using something called integrated pest management, where you're kind of thinking holistically about the environment and how you can maybe encourage the good bugs to eat the bad bugs and use what's in the environment to your advantage more. So I know apples always make the environmental working group's dirty dozen list. They made it yet again this year. But there are a lot of pesticides approved for use in apples. They aren't all used every time. They are very highly regulated, and they are targeted to specific problems at specific times. So if you ever do see that list, not all at once, here and there as they need them. Because again, pests do evolve, and they don't want to lose the potency of the things that they have available at hand.
What if you peel the apple?
Yeah, if you peel the apple, most of it is going to be on the surface. Yeah.
I read,
When's the best time to buy an apple?
They are fresh in September and October for the most part. So I think the best time to buy an apple is if you've got a local orchard, when they're on fresh, it's the best time to get them. Controlled atmosphere storage, where they put them in a gas chamber, that really gets started in the 1950s and 60s. And so they can store apples for up to a year. So if you want to know that they're this year's crop and fresh, September and October. Yeah.
I read they're trying to plant the trees so machines can pick them.
Yeah, they've been experimenting. The earliest experiments I found with robots were in the 60s. Things to like shake the trees, and the problem was bruising. But they've had fairly good success with some of the robots that they've developed recently, and I know they've been testing them in Washington and in New Zealand and other places on the off season. So we'll see. They're already planting in trellises so that it's easier for picking, and that certainly makes it a lot easier for a robot to pick. Yeah, I think that's something we'll see if they can figure out something that has a minimum amount of damage to the fruit. I think we'll be seeing that.
So if 70% of the apple supplies in the nation comes from Washington, any data, how many percent in the world?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but it's a lot. I mean, they're also, China has become a huge producer of apples in recent years. Yeah, a lot of the juice concentrates here in the United States actually are from Chinese apples. Like companies like Coca-Cola and other big companies buy a lot of juice concentrate because it's easier to ship. So China's become a huge, huge market. There are a lot of apples in Chile. Yeah, and there are companies that own orchards in, say, both Chile and Washington. Because what's happened in recent years is corporations like, say, Walmart doesn't want to deal with a whole bunch of different growers. They want to deal with one company to get all their apples.
Right.
And so we've seen a lot of consolidation within the industry since the 80s, and things consolidating into and merging of companies, and a lot of the cooperatives have closed. And part of that is in response to the supply chain of those big companies not wanting to deal with multiple growers. And then if your company has orchards in Washington and Chile, opposite seasons, you're covered. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Hi everybody, I'm Sharma Shields. I'm the Writing Education Specialist for Spokane Public Library. We have a lot of exciting events for adults, teens, and kids in our community. You can find these events on our website or follow us on social media. We look forward to seeing you at the library soon.